TE 804 students, very nice to meet you again on here. Obviously, I'm seeing you. You're seeing me. I'm not seeing you. I'm going to try to keep my little timer here, so I keep these about 10 minutes each. The first video I want to share with you is about the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. Those of you that just took the 825 class already have this information. If this is already familiar to you, you can just sit back and relax. No notes needed. The main thing is I like this approach. It has 3 stages. Now, actually, there's 6 stages whenever you go from being resistant to another culture to being totally integrated with it. But in terms of two different cultures getting together, I'm just dealing with the first 3 stages. That's where most of the conflicts are. And what are those stages? Well, the first one is defense, or I call it invisibility. No, I'm sorry, it's not. The first one is indifference, which means invisibility. The second stage is defense, which means kind of the siege mentality, like, oh, we're getting overwhelmed with these people, they're taking over. And the third stage, kind of as a worst stage in some ways, it's when you think you know all about that culture and you just ignore all the differences. I call it the condescending stage, or you're just like me, only you look different, but you're basically, your culture and our culture are the same. That means you see no differences and you ignore the real differences. And then it goes the spectrum from I don't see you to everything about you is in contrast and is a threat to me, to you're just like me. And, you know, you may look different, you may have some different cultural items, but you're just like me. 3 stages, 3 gears. First stage, I always use this example because people mostly understand it and they've understood it. The first stage is the homeless people. Your first reaction to homeless people is you don't see them. A lot of people say, oh, I didn't notice them. Oh, you see them there, but as long as they're not interacting with you, you don't get defensive. So you just go past them and you don't even see them. I've had people say that, well, when there are a few different people that might either shock you by their appearance or might be complicated, you don't understand, you tend to just look through them, look past them. They're not there. And I always like the homeless example because that's very common, that, oh, I hope somebody helps them, poor homeless people, and I just ignore them, okay? So that's the first stage. And that is, and I give some examples in here on this, and I made some copies with a little bit of print on it. You can look at it. And this has been hand-tooled. It's from a guy named Milton Bennett, and I've kind of just worked on it. The examples I give here for the first stage, you can see refugees. You can see those are migrant workers working in fields, or the elderly. People say, oh, it's an old guy. They just don't see them, you know. People say that to me now. I'll be turning 62. It's an old guy. Just ignore him. I don't want to bother that person. You know, I'm sure that somebody opens a restaurant locally and they're from a different ethnic group. You don't really worry about it. Say, oh, there's some people from India open a restaurant, or some Koreans or Chinese or a Japanese sushi gallery or something. Well, they're with that, and you know, I'm not going to worry too much about them because, you know, a little bit of local color added, a little multiculturalism, but nothing I have to get involved with. And this is a dangerous stage because they don't exist. Yeah, you acknowledge them, but I mean, you're not concerned about them. You're not going to be thinking much about them. The example I give are migrant workers. I know a story of a lady that disappeared while living with a man in a local town, and she was a Hispanic, worked in one of the meat packing places, and when she left, people kind of looked for her, the police did, but they didn't, you know, the All the relatives really weren't there except for a sister, and they said, well, who knows where she went? Maybe she just ran off, or she's a migrant, so they migrated. And they didn't realize 2 years later somebody was repairing the house and realized the man had killed her and had left her wrapped up in plastic under the porch. So eventually that man was arrested. And I always give the comparison that if that happened to me or to some guy, person in the community, and they tried to make some story about how their wife disappeared, people wouldn't accept it. They'd keep looking until they discovered the truth. They would ask questions. But because this is a person that was invisible, they didn't look very long. They weren't too concerned about it. The people that are invisible are at terrible risk to be abused, to be taken advantage of. I give an example here of Louis Lepke, who controlled the garment district. He was a mobster in New York in the 20s. And all these were ethnic minorities working in there. And so they basically muscled in on them and took control. And what were they going to do? Go to the police because they didn't speak the language. Now, the second stage is the one you're most familiar with. Why don't those people learn English? Those new kids that came into our community from that other community when we merged our schools together, they're different and they're causing trouble. And we have to watch out for them. And I'll give you no further I'll go than to give you Donald Trump, period. If you've been watching any news and you know Donald Trump, there's your answer. That's an example of the siege mentality. This also works for the foreigner. By the way, I'm giving some examples in the United States. These stages work anywhere, any situation. In China, in the 1900s or 1800s even, the Chinese revolted against being conquered by all these other countries. They had the Boxer Rebellion, made some movies about it. You probably don't know what those are. One was The Sand Pebbles with Steve McQueen a long time ago, won the Academy Award in the early 60s. And the Boxer Rebellion was an actual people fought against foreigners and tried to throw them out of Beijing, and a bunch of different countries sent their troops to take over. But it was a violation of this nationality of China. That was a defensive mode. The people of China were fighting back against the foreigners. The same thing when civil rights, when people went in and said, I'm going to set up this food counter in Alabama or North Carolina. I'm going to sit at this food counter and I'm going to ask to be served. And people said, you'll be arrested because we don't serve blacks here. And the law said they were supposed to, and there was a lot of resistance to it. And that's why we had all the murders, the lynchings, terrible things. On page 5 on here, I talk about this. And then I've got in here what people say, so you can kind of look at the examples and what needs to be done. And I want to kind of focus right now. I think it's essential that when you're in the defense stage, you try to deal with people by not calling them racist, even if they are. Because once you call people names, you can't take it back. That's pretty much the end of the discussion. But you try to combat it. You try to, by persuading people. And that's the big deal. Putting a guilt trip on people, saying you people have always been racist, is not going to change the situation. Speaking the truth doesn't change the situation. Persuading people and giving them some new understanding does. So you can read through these sheets. Stage 3 is the third one. And this is the one that I think is often overlooked. I call it the condescending attitude. It's when people say, you're just like me. The only difference is you just look different. We share the same faith. You want to be like me. You want to have values like me, because whatever my culture is the ideal culture. Thousands of years ago, the Romans said, to be a Roman citizen is the highest thing you can be. Being a Jew in the or a Hebrew in the Palestinian areas, Palestine, or being a Gaul, a German Gothic warrior or something. These are all savages. Being a Roman is the only thing that really means anything. And so you put yourself up. They put themselves up as the highest peak of civilization. And historically, we followed along with that. Oh, Rome was a great civilization. And Rome did terrible things to people, by the way. So just because you think you're the best doesn't mean you're not without doing terrible things. And the fact that you think you're the best is probably an indication that you aren't. Humility is always good for the group and control. Now, condescending is when I have a problem when people go out and they say, those poor people in Africa, those poor Canadians, or those poor South Americans, we need to go to them and bring them our civilization, our belief system, our educational system. They don't have a chance without us, you know. And once they become more like us, then we'll know that they're going to be okay. That's a very condescending attitude. People that go into a school maybe in the South and think that because people in the South speak with an accent that somehow they're not educated is ridiculous. I'm going to stop this temporarily.